Good afternoon. Welcome to the Faculty Forum Online. I'm Judy Cole, Executive Vice President and CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I will serve as moderator today. Alumni who wish to ask a question, please enter your first name and your location and your question in the form on your screen. And we will try to get to as many as we possibly can, but invariably we don't ever get to all of them. Our guest today is Professor Amy Glasmeier. Professor Glasmeier is a professor of economic geography and regional planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. She came to MIT in January of 2009 as the department's first female department head since its creation in 1933. Professor Glasmeier's research and teaching focus on economic geography and its impact on wealth, poverty, and well-being. She is best known of late for her work on the living wage calculator, a formula she developed to shine a light on the disparities between wages and costs of living around the country. Quote, "The people who babysit your children or wash your car or mow your grass are not making enough money to make ends meet," she writes. Professor Glasmeier, thanks for joining us. Please start by giving us an overview of some of the current projects in your lab that excite you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. And it's very nice to see you all out there, even though I can't see you in person. Some of the things I'm working on now all center on essentially the following question. Who in America is economically secure, and what is the basis of that security? And that means that I'm looking at everything from my colleagues to members of the military who are returning from Iraq and Afghanistan and becoming veterans and then attempting to check into the United States labor market looking for work. The work that I have just finished actually is a report for the Marines looking at their psychological health program. And I was looking at it from the perspective of access to care. So one of the key signature illnesses that has come out of the war is psychologically related, and the question is, do we have enough care available to take care of both active duty members and the veterans? And that's related to my topic, my core topic, which is economic opportunity, because of the reasons why people go into the military. So they go into the military for service reasons, but they also go into the military because it provides a range of opportunities for individuals, such as when you finish, you have access to a college education. Depending upon your status, you have access to health care, depending upon your status. So the military is actually a mechanism by which Americans work their way into the labor market and then hopefully over time achieve a middle-class income. Another project that I'm doing is, and this is an ongoing project, I get requests by organizations. I'm working with a large organization right now, looking at their ability to pay the living wage and what the consequences are. And I was just out talking with an organization in California in which we were exploring options besides just wages to serve as forms of compensation to allow an individual to increase their standards of living over time. So for example, young people, college debt is a really big issue, and the question is, alone, can you pay for that? And if you do pay for your college debt, then what are the other purchases that you have to forego, such as housing and other things? And so we were talking about having corporate matches for essentially a 401k for tuition. And we were thinking about a 401k for putting money away for saving a house, or for savings to purchase a house over time. In addition, I'm in my annual season of updating the living wage calculator, and I'm getting phone calls and emails in large number from people asking when it will be updated because they will set their wages based on that. And then finally, I'm working here in Boston. I'm a member of the Long-Term Care Commission for veterans in the state of Massachusetts, and we're looking at a set of issues that are presenting themselves both for veterans of all wars from Second World War forward and then veterans of today, and trying to really match their economic circumstances with access to the necessary goods such as housing, healthcare, et cetera.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we've got some questions coming in from alumni as usual, but first let me ask you just one question that's on my mind. Well, it might be two, but it's election season, and I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about how poverty in America has been addressed by the various platforms of candidates running for the highest office in the land.
Well, so that's a great question. There hasn't been very much discussion of poverty, and you can't really address poverty well if you don't localize it and personalize it. So we might be seeing conversations about people discussing the rate of poverty, which is about 14.9% to 15.4%, depending upon the measure you use. But what we really need to be talking about is who is poor, why are they poor, or why are they of low wealth, and where do they live? Because all of those things together really reflect the American poverty challenge. I would say that the Democrats are more likely historically to discuss this issue, and they would discuss it in terms of the failure of the market to generate the necessary conditions for everyone to have access to work and access to a basket of goods. And that there are some good reasons for that. One is geography. If you happen to live in a rural area and you had a natural resource economy and it collapsed, then there aren't very quick adjustments to make that piece back together again, and people fall into poverty. The question is, do you have a policy solution for that short term? And we do have some supplements for that. In contrast, the Republicans have addressed once, I believe, the question of poverty and lamented its existence. Their reaction, however, would be one that I think focuses more on trying to find market solutions. We're at a very unusual time now where market solutions may present themselves, i.e. we may be generating jobs, but we have to look at the wage rates because the wage rates are not paying a living wage.
So I hear all the time on NPR about the movement to go to a $15 per hour minimum wage. Would that be a living wage?
Well, so the
It depends upon where you live.
Yeah. So the $15 level, it has been applied in a number of places. So we have conversations in New York. Los Angeles has applied it, and Seattle, Tacoma has applied it. And if we think about those places, they are in general high cost. Mm-hmm. They are places where elements of a basket of goods we all need, such as housing, food, shelter, are inflated because of supply constraints. So the $15 value for Los Angeles, as an example, which has a housing shortage, or Seattle, which has a housing shortage, is really an attempt to adjust for these really big ticket items in someone's basket of goods. I work in some of the poorest parts of the country. They also happen to be rural. So a $15 wage rate would be an inappropriate wage rate for a place like that. And the reason is because the cost of living there is much less. Mm-hmm. I think the big challenge is the White House is interested in $10.10. The $15 an hour came out when people were doing calculations about what a basket of goods looked like in some of these high-cost locations. But when we think about the nation, in order to set the policy right, we have to actually set it place by place, because we could overpredict or underpredict, and we have to realize that that is when we start making adjustments and it's not being led by purely market forces. What we're going to start doing is directing people by migration to different locations. And so we want to be mindful of the fact that any actions we take has consequences.
And some of them may be unintended consequences.
Right.
Another question that came up is, could you talk a little bit about your research on children in poverty? You write that almost 50% of the nation's children live in uncertain circumstances attributable to low family income. Why is that?
Well, because so if we think about it, America is made up of many different types of families. From the nuclear family, husband, wife, 2 children, to the extended family, to a single female or a single male headed household. And so when we talk about families and we talk about children's and family settings, we really have to think about what's the image that comes up. But in general, we know that single-headed households, and in particular female single-headed households, make very low wages. They have very risky or very vulnerable attachments to the labor market, and if they have children, then those children are are essentially affected by that economic insecurity. So when we look at the population of children in the U.S. that are economically vulnerable, it's really as it reflects the family unit that they're from.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to the alumni questions now, and Andrew in DC has asked, what additions to and enhancements of the federal statistical system would increase the utility of the living wage calculator?
Thank you, Dr. Reamer. It's a great question, and I just can't, I'm really happy that he's asked me that, because he asked me that in an email. Well, the answer is, what we really need is localized data. That's the number one thing we need, is information that reflects the local conditions, because then we can legitimately say we know something about the cost structure and we know what the pressures are for people who are trying to make a living wage and trying to put a life together. For the first time, I've been doing a ground truthing exercise in a particularly high cost location in the United States in conjunction with a firm, looking at whether or not non-census related data give me different values for the cost of living. And in fact, what we're finding is the calculator is pretty good at getting a basket of goods that people have to purchase using the data that we use from the census. So yay for the census, it means our data is pretty good. But with that said, what I mean by local is I need spatially disaggregated data. That's the number one question that policymakers ask me. It's what individuals ask me, because our data are scaled at the county level. And if we could actually go down to census tracts or aggregations that geographic aggregations that made sense, we'd be able to say something much more precise than that.
And that was my follow-up question, was how local do we have to get?
Right.
County, town,
right.
neighborhood, and I hear you saying
Right.
you think it's maybe more like neighborhood.
Well, let's say that we have, I want to think of the world as zones. So we have zones where there is residential, we have zones where there's commercial, then we have overlaps, and we're going to have different housing costs in those different types of markets because of the attributes of those places.
Right.
I will say that I am working with an organization just beginning here in Boston, and we're talking about doing some experimentation of a much more localized nature. So it's not that there isn't data per se, because the census data is rather specific, right? It's down to the address of a location. It's what's available to me when I build my tool. And so we're going to be using some estimation procedures to try to work with a philanthropic organization here to help them map their region to better determine how their investments influence poverty circumstances.
Fascinating. John in Katona, New York asks, what is your view of the benefits of a higher minimum wage versus a universal basic income?
It's a really great question. I really appreciate that one. Well, so the thing about wages, which I think historically have been so important in explaining how America has evolved, is, at least historically, wages were set and then negotiated over time. And as wages went up, it signaled to employers the value of a person, and they would be likely to invest in that individual, right? So when we think about the increase in wages, employers expect something in return when they raise wages. And what they expect in return is better human capital. That is, the skills embodied in the individual. And employers historically were willing to increase wages because they were then able to attach that person to them, you know, through dedication and long-term employment. And in return, they would also be making investments in that individual. Today, however, that relationship between human capital development and wage rates is somewhat broken. And I would say employers are, and a significant portion of the economy is made up of jobs where employers are expecting a person to bring a lot of skill, not necessarily paying them for that skill, but more importantly, that it's a revolving door and they're willing to live with that because actually people can do basic jobs for which they're willing to pay a wage. Now, in terms of a universal minimum income, that's an idea that's being explored in Europe, and I actually think that we basically have that for people that are living on Social Security. They have a basic minimum income. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the poverty data, I'm going to show a graph here that is, let me just get myself there. So this is the map that we make every year. The census makes this every year when they release poverty figures. And what we see is the height of poverty in the United States, which was only the height of poverty because it was the first time we published data. I want you to know that, 1959. And then we can see what's happened to the poverty rate over time. And what it's basically done is gone up and down, been flat, and then, flat in terms of change, and a little bit of uptick here and there. I would argue that the upticks are often associated with national policy. So it's not just economic growth that produces changes in the poverty rate, but it's also national policy, because national policy is used to intervene to diminish some of the negative consequences of poverty. But if you think about it, back in 1959, Social Security was going to ultimately become the floor under which elderly persons in the United States would not fall. That is essentially a guaranteed income. Interestingly, for the longest time, that kept elderly folks at a very low level of poverty compared to all the other population groups. As we've seen increases in healthcare costs and greater instability in the economy and a decline in various types of pension benefits, the elderly economic security has actually gone down, and Social Security has become much more important, even as it is, if you're at $1 above the poverty line because of your Social Security payment, you're $1 above the poverty line with that dollar for Social Security, right? So everybody has a different Social Security payment depending upon how much they worked. So I think this is a really important topic to consider, is what do you get when you provide people with economic security? And I can't really argue that Social Security today, as it is dollar valued, provides pure economic security for everyone. But what I can say is that for many people, it is the difference between being in poverty or not. And if that's what makes people, and we have a lot of experimental evidence about how people feel, how long their lives last, what levels of other care they need, as a result by having some sort of floor. So I think this is a topic that we should actually discuss openly as a society, because let's face it, we are paying Social Security, we're paying Social Security disability insurance, we are paying veterans pensions, we are paying veterans disability. We have a lot of federal money that we are paying to support people, and rather than them having to feel like they're getting something that's as a result of a deficiency of them, why don't we call it what it is, which is it's a supplement to have a secure life.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me. Eli in Las Vegas asks, you mentioned that unions and religious organizations have used the calculator. Has deploying your data sets helped them make their case?
Yes, it has actually. Yes, it has. And those are two different audiences. Most of the time, religious and philanthropic organizations contact me and want to use the tool because they're concerned that they are essentially ministering or professing the care of others, and yet they have people that are working for them that are not making a living wage. And so they are doing it for ethical reasons. In terms of unions, they are recognizing that when it comes to negotiating, what is the basis upon which they make a wage claim? And I've had very interesting conversations with union organizations and lawyers representing them saying, it's not that we think we have to have an astronomical wage, it's that we want to have a basis upon which we can say we can deliver a wage that somebody can live on. So they're looking at it as it's their responsibility as a representative of workers to not make an unrealistic claim, to make a claim that can be justified on the basis of some economic principle.
And it certainly makes sense. Samantha in New Jersey asks, I live in New Jersey where people are arguing against wage hikes because landlords just raise rents right after wage increase legislation. How do you combat that if it's true? That's
a good question. And And we always are interested in the extent to which when we do something with public policy, does it have an unintended consequence? And to the extent that something like that would happen, it probably would not be a uniform transformation, but it would be at the margin something that an individual would experience.
It seems to me it's one of those that may be very local also, because
Yeah.
it probably depends upon
On the market.
how tight the housing market is. So in
Yeah.
places like New York or Boston, where we know we have a housing shortage, that would be a more common phenomena than in places where there was a housing surplus. They wouldn't get away with it.
Right. Well, and that's what we hope is actually regulating things. But the truth is, we have, markets are an institution that exist in fact, but also in our minds. And we ascribe to them behaviors that are supposed to, we have a very optimistic view of how markets are supposed to work. I mean, Americans are optimistic. I'm an optimist. But the bottom line is that markets are perturbed by things that we don't consider, or that they are not uniform. So, for example, your rent might be $5 less because your apartment looks down on a freeway, right? And that's because the owner of that building has already done the discounting and saying my property is slightly less valuable, and I want to fill it up because I don't want to live with a month without rent, right? And so, I would say that the more pressure is placed on the market, the more variable the reaction will be to any change in any of the variables that go into determining quantity and prices.
Mm-hmm. So Kathy in Tampa, Florida asks, are there any admirable tax breaks at the local level, city and state, that are helping improve wages or cost of living? How does your research take income tax free states like Florida into account?
It's a really good question. It actually relates to the conversation I was having out in California. That is, what instruments, if we call the tools in the economy instruments, what are the instruments we have to actually do positive policy, to do positive change? And we were discussing actually out in California B Corps, so designations of businesses that are indicating that they follow a set of principles, and those principles could include such things as paying living wages and could have a positive tax consequence. Many of those gestures actually have influence on public perception. So for example, the companies that have gone public and used my tool, IKEA is a good example, they have definitely benefited from it in terms of it's essentially viewed as a market leader, it is viewed as a good employer. I'm not familiar with the level of detail of individual place-by-place tax policy, so I don't really want to comment on that. In the case of the state of Florida, I would say that I have people who use the tool there as well, and their focus is as much on getting workers who are willing to work hard, skill up, and stay with them as they're looking at any other sort of influence.
So Chris in Brooklyn asks, some argue that tipping is hurting the service industry because it interferes with everyone's understanding of what workers truly make. Do you agree?
I would say, well, again, there's behavioral economics research, I'm sure, on this as to what the public perception of this. My own reaction to that question is people are probably discounting. That means that they're already taking into account the fact that a tip exists. And I don't know what the proportion of the population is that tip, but we certainly know that the tip income was institutionalized in restaurant workers' wages. And so whether or not they were getting paid less than what would be considered the minimum wage because that potential money actually existed. I think that what's interesting now is to look at the experiments where restaurant employers are essentially offering a wage that's a living wage as essentially embodying the tip income into the actual wage, rather than their customers tipping. And the argument from the restaurateur's perspective is, if my wages are going to go up, I want to be able to essentially normalize or capture that tip income and wrap it into my wage paid, because at least then I know what's happening to my costs.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know my costs are going to go up. How do I actually adjust for that? And they're also, the second thing they're worried about is that customers won't come if there is a wage rate plus a increased wage rate and an assumed tip associated with it.
Yeah, you see that difference when you travel internationally in their cultures where they don't have a tipping habit, and it's actually much easier. Amit in New York asks, what about the developing world? Do you think microloans are helping to lift all boats?
So in the developing world, there are people that are building tools like I have, just to say that as an introduction. And there are organizations that I talk to, and I've seen their maps that show me what their policies are in working in the global south. And there are corporations that fundamentally are ethically consistent. That is, they are thinking in terms what's prevailing wages, what they ought to be paying, what is the benefit package they should be providing, and they even are working with their suppliers to actually carry that out. So there are those great organizations out there that we would probably argue are doing the right thing.
Is your calculator just domestic?
It's just domestic. Although I did have a conversation, there's a group in London that is working with Pete Marwick, the accounting firm, and they are attempting to put together a global tool. I did some research on putting a global tool together and actually thought that if I was going to do something like that, I would heavily rely upon MIT alumni. And the reason is because you got to ground truth those things. You know, you're in the middle of Beijing and you could have an antiquated apartment building and it costs $50 a month, and you could have right next door to it a very beautiful apartment building that costs $5,000 a month. And if you don't have somebody ground truthing it, you really don't have much to say. In terms of the microloans affecting the families, microloans create the possibility of a flow of money. So we think about money in two ways: stocks, fixed, and flows. And if you're a household, you need flow. And how do you get flow? Through some kind of transaction. And if a microloan allows somebody to do some type of activity that produces a flow of income over time, probably you can say that the status of an individual accessing that capital is better off than no capital at all. There are some perverse consequences of microloans depending upon what the interest rate is, depending upon what the person invests in, depending upon how big their market is, depending upon how easy it is for somebody to get into your market. Because if your market is easy to penetrate, then you could have a high-priced loan and you did a great job, but next door somebody comes up and basically steals your idea. So microloans are mechanisms for getting money into people's hands and hopefully having that money be sufficient so that savings is generated, so you can make investments over time. And it works some places and other places it doesn't.
Bruce in Salt Lake City asks, is the Affordable Health Care Act having any impact, in your opinion, on an average family's means to pay the bills?
Yes, I would say that it has. And I would say that we have to think about this from the standpoint of population groups. So for individuals who were working for an employer who provided health care, then let's just take those folks off the table, because the ACA might have had an influence, but it gets complicated. But let's take the population of people who didn't have health care. So at the very least, for the individuals who didn't have health care, they also, therefore, were susceptible to unpredictable health circumstances, somebody in their family being ill, a lot of uncertainty that directly feeds into the labor market. And if we can't get to work, we don't get paid. If we don't get paid, we can't pay our bills. And so the ACA has produced a floor that theoretically, at least, people can't fall through. And when people can't fall through the floor, they can make plans. And we're all planners, right? We all need to plan the minimum. For some families, the ACA has altered their cost package for health care. And it's had positive and negative consequences. But the overall picture really demonstrates that Americans are a more secure society with health care available and affordable health care available.
Well, that certainly makes a lot of sense to me. Anne in Dallas asks you to please talk about some specific companies that have deployed your calculator and what the short and long-term effects have been.
Great question. So a lot of the companies that have used my tool, they don't really actually want to be public. And so I mentioned one that is very well known, but actually a lot of them don't want to be public, and the reason is because the wage rate setting process is a private relationship between the employer and the employee. And employers are willing to make local decisions and have local conversations, but becoming, the headline in a New York Times article isn't something that they feel that is what they really actually want to do. So I really, honestly, I can't tell you.
Can't talk about them.
I can't really. I mean, I feel if I did pick one, then I'm privileging somebody else. Since IKEA's been in the news, I can say that. But a lot of organizations have contacted IKEA, and a lot of the companies that you buy goods and services from actually have looked at this. Then there are also organizations that don't use the tool but have raised their wage rate, right? So if you look at Walmart, for example, Walmart has raised its wage rate. And the reason it's raised its wage rate is it's operating in highly differentiated markets where there's a lot of pressure on low-wage employers to raise wages because there's more low-wage jobs. There's more jobs that pay marginally higher than maybe they pay, right? So depending upon the market circumstances, employers are feeling pressure to raise wages because there are other jobs people can get that pay more. What I think would be really important is to be able to track employers that actually get the wage rate increase signal and go, oh, my job is to improve the skill of these people so they stay working for me, and that over time they add their productivity enhancements to my business. That's the whole quid pro quo here, right? If I'm an employer, I pay you more money, what do I get? I get loyalty, you show up every day, and actually you have some hidden talents there, and you're willing to be a little bit of a local manager of our business, right? You're gonna make everybody in the business be happy and work hard, right? And in return, at the end of the year, I'll watch your performance and I'll give you a wage increase. So it's supposed to work that way. It's supposed to be this interactive process of shared wealth.
And it used to be at one point in time. Where did it start to break down? What caused that breakdown?
Unions were very important in building in the relationship of wage rates and productivity. They were a mechanism by which workers, if you didn't perform over time, you wouldn't be there, right? So there was in a sense, an organization that was managing the labor side of things for the employer. And in return, the employer would say, okay, these are my targets, this is what we're hoping to achieve, and let's work this out together. Now, I would say that in the history of American labor negotiations, it was never quite so neat and tidy, and there was a lot of struggle that went on. But overall, during periods of significant economic growth, employers added income to workers, and they improved their capital, which enhanced workers' productivity, so that the consequence was that the impact of raising the wage wasn't a negative consequence.
So was it the loss of union jobs or the movement to de-unionize the labor force that you think caused a lot of this breakdown?
It's been a lot of things. Technological change, starting in the 60s, really began this long-term trajectory of geographic migration of jobs out of the United States. Long before we talk about it, 1960, I can track you to companies that were making decisions for investing in Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, often in response to American trade policy, by the way, where we were creating inducements for employers to produce there. So that was one, is technological change. For the longest time, that was considered the most important influence. But we can now see that actually the geographic migration of jobs to China and lower cost locations had a negative consequence in terms of what filled that gap in the United States.
Right. So getting back to our alumni questions, Sandy in Baltimore asks, given that youth unemployment is 30 to 50% in some cities, wouldn't it make sense to have a lower minimum wage for those under 21 in order to provide them with a job that they would otherwise not get?
It's an interesting question, and it includes both place and it includes demographics. 21-year-olds you're able to pick up a gun and join the Army at 18. So for me, what I would consider youth is probably 16 years old. And so I would say that we really need to think about this as a multidimensional problem here, and that we have families that are headed by individuals who are 21 years old. One argument for having a lower wage for a 16-year-old and maybe the 12 to 16-year-olds, because people do actually work. I worked as a babysitter when I was 10. Was that there was a quid pro quo, that I get training and skill enhancement so that as I move up in age, I am going to be a better employee. If we were to otherwise pay young people significantly less than the minimum wage, what we would end up doing is having these service-related jobs migrating age-wise down to individuals who are being paid lower. Mm-hmm. And I think one really interesting question for the audience is, what do companies really think about setting wages? So let me give you an example. I did an experiment with the tool where I was with a group of 30 house builders. And their project was to make a bid on a contract for a wealthy individual in which they paid a minimum wage and they got the profit rate they wanted. And so we did this little experiment. We gave them a spreadsheet, we gave them the data, they had a maximum budget, and every single group of the builders were able to come up with a wage rate that was fair for everybody, and also that they made the profit rate they wanted. So the question then is, why do we have so much struggle over the figuring out of what the wage rate ought to be? And why is it that we have this sense that people are always looking for the lowest wage to pay possible? Because we set the experiments so that they couldn't pay the lowest wage possible. They had to pay a living wage. So some of the things that the people that were in the experiment said was, gee, I never actually sat down and looked at this like this before. I never had the data and the spreadsheet and the multipliers, so I could actually figure out what I should say, not what I do say. And then others said, well, what I figured out was actually I could play with my variable cost over here. That is my inputs, like my nails and my wood and my various things that I buy. And I can really optimize those and minimize the cost of those. And that gives me more money to pay over here in the wage bill. And then they said other things that were very interesting about, well, this person has worked for me for 25 years. And while they're not the most productive person, they're always on the job at the right time, in the right place, and they stay after work. And so I'm going to make sure that I have a little bit of money to put aside to take care of these people as well. So that has led me to believe that if we made a lot of those experiments, we might discover such things as businesses are not necessarily educated to optimize these things. And that maybe what we should be thinking about is to set a set of social policies that we would like to all achieve, that they are happy that their workers are happy, they're happy that they got that contract, and they're happy to make that profit rate. And they reduce their lack of uncertainty, right? So if that's were set as objectives, would more employers actually look at the wage rate and say, you know, I don't have to pay $7.25 an hour. I can actually pay $8 an hour. I won't have to have as many people turning over because my workers will stay longer because I know the people I pay $8 stay for the long run. And you know, they might actually start thinking in terms of, how can I do a better job of my job in order to be able to allow other people to do as good a job as they possibly can for me.
Yeah, in order to have the money to pay them to do the better job. Fascinating. That's really an interesting sort of experiment that you did. Glenda in Austin, Texas asks, how should payment of student interns figure within the wage rate?
We've got ourselves on a slippery slope now. When the economy was really in bad shape, we, I think, probably altruistically felt better to give somebody an opportunity than to have them sitting idle. I want to believe that's sort of the thinking that went on.
Let them get some experience,
That's right.
even
That's
if they
right.
can't make any money.
But on the other hand, we were having them do work that was using all of the individual's human capital, which means I was benefiting from all that investment that person put in themselves and their parents put in, and I wasn't paying anything for it. And so if you think about it, you were getting a really good deal, and it was a really unfortunate deal for the individual. Why? Because so for those of you out there that haven't thought about the labor market, here's how I think about it. There's general human capital, which is mine. I own it, I produce it, I pay for it, I go out and get it, and I keep it up. And there's specific human capital, which is something I get from my employer. And when I am in a job, I can keep all my general human capital, which might make your business more efficient, because you're not paying me for it. You're only paying me for the human capital you invested in. But I'm a nice person, so I share, and we're both happy. So if we think about it in the intern situation, that person was putting all of their built-up knowledge and essentially giving it to you, and what were you actually adding? And I think that should be something that we have as a part of the conversation is when you do an internship, you better make sure that that person can document, this is what I got out of that experience. Because at the very least, you're really benefiting from all that they know, and they're getting very little in return.
Fascinating. It sort of violates some of the mythology that experience is so important. And if you can say that, you were continuously employed, even if it was for no pay, no wage, you're better off than if you were sitting idle.
Well, and I mean, I think that one of the really big challenges today is there are so few jobs. Just as an example, what I worry about the most is employment for men. And I worry about employment for men that have high school and 2 years of college or less. And that's because the economy doesn't generate jobs for men with that profile. And what are their options? Well, one of their options is to go into the military. One of their options is to pick up, casual work. And one of their options is to get a $7.25 minimum wage job. But there's very little mobility with those jobs. So how are we going to manage that, when we're thinking about a significant portion of the population? I think it's important to remember it still is only 30% of Americans who go to college, right? We're not at the top of the heap when it comes to college education. And that is the one leveler we say is out there. And we also know, actually, that leveler is starting to erode a little bit, right? As we see people realizing graduate education becomes this key component of economic mobility.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question here. Stephen in Albany, Indiana says, arguably the most distressed city in America today is Detroit. How do you diagnose the economy there today?
I was born in Detroit, and I come from a Motor City family, so I have a kind of a feeling for that. It's a mess. And also, it is shrinking into a size that is much less expansive than it was. Remember, it was once the most dynamic economy in the United States. It was a huge city. It went for miles and miles and miles. It has something like 35,000 vacant buildings. It's got 15 square miles of vacant land. So it was sized for a global industry, for the biggest economy in the world. And now what is happening is it's shrinking. Going forward, you're watching people put things together. There's a lot of experimentation. There's a lot of philanthropic money. What does it need? Obviously, it needs solid employment, and it needs employment for the population that's there. Detroit still has a complex population of a significant number of people that are relatively poorly educated, have had relatively few experiences with the labor market. What we're seeing is a patina put on the top right now of things which have a certain luster, right? There's a new company that's just starting to make watches in Detroit, and we have other companies that are trying experiments. It's a long way to go, though, to right size a city that was once as big as Detroit. And they're making the best of it. I think it's an experiment. We need to watch it to see and learn from it.
Well, on behalf of the MIT Alumni Association, thank you very much, Amy. This has been a wonderful conversation. And thanks to our viewing audience for joining us today. Alumni, if we didn't get to your question, we're sorry. We'll pass it on to Professor Glasmeier after the webcast. Feel free to share other questions or comments on Twitter using the hashtag MIT faculty, and we'll get your questions and pass them on. You can also view an archive of past faculty forums online by visiting the Learn section on the Alumni Association website. Please join us next month for another session of Faculty Forum Online.